Welcome to my dark happy place. My name's Desiree, and each week I'll be taking you with me as I delve into a different true crime case. Thanks for joining me. I'm so glad you made it. Welcome to episode number 3. Today we're going to be talking about a cold case that went unsolved for decades, and the only reason it was eventually solved is because of a job application. So with that being said, cue the trigger warning.
Today's episode is intended for mature audiences only. The topic today contains real events that happen to real people. There will be graphic descriptions of murder. Listener discretion is advised.
Alright, let's get into the case of Sondra Better. Sondra Harriet Better was born on June 25, 1930 in Brooklyn, New York to parents Jack and Molly Sotnick. When she was fresh out of high school, she met her husband Seymour Zeke Better. Zeke was born on February 14, 1926, a Valentine's baby, so he was a few years older than Sondra. Like I said, Sondra had just gotten out of high school, but Zeke had been fighting in World War II and had just returned home. The two of them were set up on a blind date in Brooklyn in 1948. For them, it was love at first sight. Zeke said that he started seeing her and just never stopped. They quickly got married, went on to build a life together, and they had 3 daughters and lived in New York up until about 1988, once the girls were all grown and out on their own. After all the girls were out of the house, Zeke gave up his electrical supply business, and then he and Sandra moved down to Highland Beach, Florida. Highland Beach is a small, quiet community where most of the houses have private boat slips and swimming pools. It's a nice place for a couple to go retire and relax. Sondra wasn't the type to just sit around all day and be bored, so without having her daughters around and being in a new place, she decided that she was going to pick up a part-time job. One of her friends recommended that she work at a place called Luche's Consignment Shop in Delray Beach, so she did. She applied and she started working there. Zeke said that Sondra enjoyed getting perked up and pretty every day for work. Very tiny lady. She was 95 pounds, 5'2", so very petite. She worked at Luche's for about 8 years and was in her final week before retiring. After she finished her final week at work, her and Zeke were planning to go back up to New York for a little bit to visit their daughters, and they were going to renew their vows because it was going to be their 50th wedding anniversary. Can you imagine that? 50 years together. And they weren't sick of each other. That's amazing. You'd never really hear about that happening anymore. And it's so precious that they were going to go back up and they were still so in love with each other that they wanted to renew their vows. But that makes me so much sadder to tell you about the rest of the case. On August 24th of 1998, 68-year-old Sondra went to work just like it was any other day. It was towards the end of the day. She was working alone around closing time, and there was still a handful of people in the store, and nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. So about 30 minutes after closing time, around 6 p.m., a guy named Tyler Smith and his girlfriend were walking down Federal Highway, where the consignment shop was, and they were trying to find a couch to buy, and that's when they noticed Luche's. They noticed that it was still open, so they went in to see what they could find. Unfortunately, they didn't find what they were looking for. Instead, they came upon a gruesome scene. Sondra was lying on the floor in the fetal position in the back of the store in a pool of blood. There were shards of broken glass from a vase around her body. Tyler told his girlfriend immediately to go and get help while he went to see if Sondra was still alive. Tyler's girlfriend ran next door to the Signorama store, and she got a man named Mike Snyderman to call the police. From the looks of it, Sondra had been beaten in the head with a blunt object. She had her throat slit, and she had been stabbed several times. She did try to fight back, and she had a lot of defensive wounds on her hand. She fought so hard that one of her fingers was nearly severed, so she was quite literally fighting for her life. Next to her body, there were 2 decorative marble balls, and there was another one from the set that was still on a glass table on its wooden tray near the area. The 3rd ball had fingerprints on it, which was able to give police something to go off of. There were drops of blood leading from Sandra's body to an empty cash register and then out the front door onto the sidewalk. So police looked around, they looked for a murder weapon, and believed that she was stabbed and had her throat slit with a cake knife. And the reason they thought that that's what the weapon was is because they found an empty box for one from the store that had blood on it. As for a motive for the murder, they assumed that it was robbery because of the empty register, but that didn't make a lot of sense because Sondra herself had not been robbed. She was still wearing her diamond wedding ring, she was still wearing her Rolex watch, so robbery could have been the reason, but why would they only take the money in the register if that was the point? Like, she had these expensive items on her. If robbery was the reason, they would have took those too. While the police were assessing the scene and trying to find out some information that they could go off of, Zeke was at home getting his and Sondra's dinner ready. Time had been going by and Sondra should have been home by now. Delray Beach was only about 15 minutes away from Highland Beach. So at about 5 minutes to 6, he tried calling her store and got no answer. Just a few minutes later, he called the store next door and asked if they'd seen Sondra, and he was told he needed to get down to the shop immediately. If he wasn't already frantic with worry, now he had to be panicking. He could have been thinking, oh, she got stopped in traffic or something, somebody stayed late trying to make a deal, but he wouldn't have called the store next door if he didn't think something was very wrong. So Zeke took off. He got down to the consignment shop as fast as he could, and that's when he saw the police and the yellow tape, and he just fell apart. His wife of nearly 50 years had been brutally murdered, and he didn't get a chance to say goodbye. He didn't get to give her a last hug or a last kiss, and it's just absolutely heartbreaking. Police questioned the people in the area to get an idea of where to start with for identifying the killer, besides having the prints and the blood at the scene. One of Sondra's co-workers, a woman named Lee Mendoza, said that her husband Lloyd would often come and help Sondra lock up during closing time because sometimes she was a little weary because there were some homeless in the area that would hang out. It made her a little nervous. That didn't seem to be the case on the day of her murder because Lloyd never got a call asking him to come down and help her lock up. Witnesses said there had been a white van parked across the street right about the time when Sondra would have been murdered, and the white van was seen with 2 men in it. The van also had the name of a Boca Raton business on it. At first, these 2 men were not looked at as suspects. They were more so just looked as witnesses. So they were just trying to find them so they could ask them some questions. They were in the area. The best description that they got of the men were that they were white males in their 20s or 30s, and there were sketches of the van and men that were put out to the public asking to help locate them. After a little bit more digging, it was discovered that the second man from the van had been in the shop haggling over a couch. The man was described as being about 6 feet tall with light blonde hair. Multiple witnesses had described the same man, so now that man in the van was a suspect because he was one of the last ones seen with Sondra. The FBI got brought in on this case, and together them and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement came up with a profile for their suspected killer. They said that the man was somebody who was easily angered by women and was unable to control his violent urges. They had a theory that the man who killed Sondra could have been reminded of a different woman who had caused him frustration in his past, and thought that the confrontation while they were haggling over the couch could have caused him to snap and kill Sondra. Detective Robert Stevens of the Delray Beach Police Department called it a transfer of anger and said that those around him were still in danger because of his lack to control his impulses. They believed the man was not a homeless or drifter and was somebody from the community. Dale Hinman, the statewide coordinator for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, said they didn't believe the man had ever killed before, but that he did probably have a violent past and had a relationship with a wife or girlfriend recently end. Luce's was the only shop on that strip of federal highway that had an elderly woman working alone, so police believed that the killer knew that ahead of time and had targeted her, and that this was not just a by-chance situation. As a way to hopefully gain some more information, a $2,000 reward was offered, and that reward would eventually be upped to $10,000 to anyone that was able to give information leading to an arrest in Sondra's case. With the prints and the blood and the witnesses' descriptions of the possible killer, you think it'd be fairly easy for police to solve this case. Police put all that information into their databases, but they got no matches. There were a few suspects that were brought in and were interviewed. There was a man who went to a hospital with a cut on his hand the night that Sondra was killed. There was a furniture mover who left town and had relocated to the Midwest almost immediately after Sondra's death. There was another man who had kept coming into the shop after her death and was asking about it over and over, asking for details, seeing if there were updates. All of them seemed like possibilities. They were interviewed, but they were all cleared by police, and so they were again left with no suspects. By the end of 2000, within 2 years of being murdered, her case had gone cold. It doesn't mean that police stopped looking, though, because they were constantly trying to get new leads. Detective Stevens worked on this case tirelessly. There were at least 36 men whose DNA had been tested against the blood that was found at the scene, but none of them were a match. As of 2002, so 4 years after the murder, at least 45 suspects had been eliminated. And honestly, it seems like the police were really working this case. And Detective Stevens worked on this case until he was retired, and then even after, he would call in and look for updates and stuff. Zeke was invested in making sure that he did whatever he could to stay close to the case and made sure that it stayed open. After Sondra's murder, he volunteered as a parking meter attendant for the police department, and he did this for 15 years. Zeke described Sondra as a phenomenal person and said that losing Sondra was a nightmare. He said, quote, "I still miss her terribly. I never got to say goodbye. I will always miss her no matter where life takes me. I will never, ever stop missing her," unquote. As a tribute to Sondra's memory, Zeke funded a scholarship in her honor at the Florida Atlantic University called the Sondra Better Memorial Fund for criminal justice students. I wonder if he chose criminal justice because he was hoping if fresh new people got in to look at her case, maybe they'd be able to find something and get it closed. In 2015, Zeke sadly passed away on September 1st without ever getting answers for what happened to his wife. The two were finally reunited and buried together at the new Montefiore Cemetery in West Babylon, New York. Now, a lot of the times, that's where the story would end. The case has been cold for 17 years. Many suspects have been eliminated. They have the DNA and the fingerprints, and there's no matches coming up in the database. What else is there to do? Except this case does have an ending. In January of 2019, there was finally a hit on the fingerprints in AFIS, which is the National Automated Fingerprint Identification System database. These prints were new to the system. They were not just a set that had been overlooked. So, whose prints were they? The fingerprints were those of a man named Todd Barkett. 51-year-old Todd had submitted his fingerprints in December of 2018 as part of a job application for the Agency of Healthcare Administration to work as a CNA in a nursing home. Once his fingerprints made a hit in AFIS, police looked into him a little bit and discovered that he matched witnesses' descriptions as well. Todd was 6'2", about 175 pounds, and blonde, just like the guy that had been seen inside haggling over the couch. So who is Todd? Todd was born to parents Anthony and Virginia Barkett in 1968 at New Britain Hospital. He grew up in Wallingford, Connecticut with his brother Christian, and they went to Lyman Hall High School. While he was in school, he was the quarterback on the football team and was part of the school's only football state championship team in 1985. Around 1992, he married his wife, Tracy, and together the two ended up moving to Florida and lived in a mobile home around the Lantana area. Lantana is about 15 minutes north of Delray Beach, where Sondra was killed. So, Todd matches the description, he's in the general area, his prints are found at the scene, all signs point to him as the one who did it. The reason he never came up in the databases before is because he had no criminal history prior to or after Sondra's murder. He did have some minor traffic violations, but he didn't have any felonies, so he was never fingerprinted or put into the system. The closest thing he had to an actual criminal charge was in 1999 when he was arrested for a bad check, but the charge was dropped. Around 2004, Todd and his wife moved to the Tampa area of Florida, which is about 4 hours across the bottom part of Florida. With all of the information that they now had gathered and matches in their database, police were able to get a warrant for Todd's DNA so they could test it against what was found at the scene. On March 25th of 2019, police went to Todd's apartment. At this time, he was living in Brandon, Florida, which is right around the Tampa area. He obviously wanted to know why police were there and why they wanted his DNA, so they just told him. They said that they were looking into a murder at Luce's consignment shop from 1998 in Delray Beach. He said that, yeah, he'd been to a few consignment shops in Delray Beach and in Boca Raton around that time, but he couldn't recall if he'd actually been to Luce's because most of the shops that he'd been into were for clothing, not for furniture. Notice how he also said he was in Boca Raton, which is where the work van that was in the area that day was from. So there's another connection. Delray Beach is basically a halfway point between Boca Raton and Lantana. While police were speaking with Todd, they noticed that he had a scar on his face that ran from the right side of his mouth down under the right side of his chin, so they asked him about it. He told them that it came from a dog bite from when he was younger. So they took that as his story and took his DNA and they were off. But they didn't really believe his story about the dog. Instead, they went back and looked at his license from previous years to see if that scar was there. In his 1997 picture, he did not have this scar. This scar did not come up in his license picture until 2002. Police believe that the scar came from the fight with Sondra because she had fought so hard. They believe that she's the one that gave him that scar. So now they have his fingerprints, they have his description, he's admitting to being in the area, going to the consignment shops. He has this mysterious scar that came up after her murder. That's a lot, right? They don't have the DNA yet, but they're testing it. So they test his DNA against some that was found on a plastic bag at the murder scene, and bingo fucking dingo, it was a match. On March 27th, 2019, at 8 a.m., police went to Todd's apartment and arrested him, 20 years after Sondra's murder. When he opened the door, they told him he was under arrest, and he just shrugged and said, okay. He probably knew that he was done for when they came to get his DNA, so I'm not surprised that he had such a whatever attitude about it. That doesn't mean he made their job any easier. He didn't talk to them. He was very uncooperative other than that. When Todd was arrested, Detective Stevens, the one who I said had been working on the case even after his retirement, said that Sondra's family was very happy about the arrest and that it brings the police a lot of joy when they are finally able to solve a case and bring someone in. The Delray Beach Police Department put out a statement on Twitter and said, quote, Todd Barkett almost got away with murder, but the dogged effort of the Delray Beach Police Department detectives and crime scene investigators, past and present, caught up with him 20 years after leaving his fingerprints and blood at a brutal scene. May Sondra Better rest in peace, unquote. Todd was taken to the Hillsborough County Jail with no bond and was then extradited to Palm Beach County Jail. He was taken in for his bail hearing once he was at Palm Beach County Jail. Judge Ted S. Burris gave Todd no bail because this was a possible death penalty case. Even though he was in prison, as a formality, the judge also ordered that Todd have no access to weapons or contact with the Better family. Todd invoked his Sixth Amendment right and demanded that he got a speedy trial. So just a couple months after his arrest, his trial started on August 19th of 2019, and Palm Beach County Circuit Judge Cheryl Caracuzzo presided over the trial. A lot of times I feel like defendants don't get on the stand because it's better for them to say nothing than to go up there and say something that might hurt their case more than it helps it. But Todd did testify on his own behalf. He said that his reason for going to Luche's that day was because he had the intention of buying a dog bowl that he had seen there at a separate time when he had been there with his wife. He said that they were there a few days before and that she'd been looking at it, and then he also gave an explanation for how his fingerprints got on the marble ball. He said that when he was there with his wife that day, he had picked it up to see if she liked it, and she wasn't very fond of it, so he put it back down, and that's how his prints got on that marble ball. He says that he showed up on August 24th of 1998 and saw that Sondra was dead already, and rather than calling the police, he went and stole $100 from the register. He also said that he had never done anything like this before. He was talking about the theft when he was talking about it, but in my mind, maybe he was also talking about the murder. If he'd never murdered anyone before, that statement also makes sense. He also gave an explanation as to why his blood was on the register. He said that when he got in the store and was stealing the money, he had cuts on his hand because he'd been working outside that day. Let's dissect his testimony here for a second, because there's one major discrepancy in what he originally told police. He had originally told them that he didn't think he'd ever been there because he'd only really gone to clothing shops. But now all of a sudden, oh yeah, I was there with my wife. We were looking around a few days before. That's why my fingerprints are there. Oh yeah, I was there trying to buy something for my wife that she saw a few days ago. And I just happened to walk in and she was dead. And instead of calling for help, I just decided to take some money. Okay, yeah, sure, buddy. A woman named Mary Jane Hartog testified that she was at the store the day of the murder and she had seen Sondra speaking with a man at the register at around 5:30 to 5:45, and they were talking about the price of a couch. She said that after police released the sketch of the man that was seen in the van that was thought to be a suspect, and seeing that compared to Todd, she immediately knew that he was the one she had seen talking with Sondra about the couch. She said that she was sure that that person was Todd Barkett. Something at the trial that could work in Todd's favor, in his defense, was the fact that the balls by Sondra did not have his fingerprints on them. And the third ball that did have his fingerprints on it was not kept as evidence. Why wouldn't they keep that as evidence? It's the one thing besides the blood that you have that you can match something to directly. It's not just oh, well, I think I saw this guy there. It's a definitive, either it's his fingerprints or his not. Why would you not keep it? Instead of keeping the actual ball, they just took like a latent print, like, you know, where they put the tape down and take the print back. They took one of those and it was just put into the system. So they didn't have an actual tangible thing that they could test his fingerprint against. Assistant Public Defender Joseph Walsh said, quote, "You'll never see the very ball Mr. Barkett is alleged to have touched in that store. There was a failure in how the processing of the crime scene was conducted," unquote. I mean, yeah, they should have definitely kept the ball there, and they could have pulled it out and been like, hey, see, look, it's got his fucking prints all over this shit. The defense mentioned that if the third ball is the one that was thought to have been the one to bludgeon Sondra, why wasn't there blood on it? I mean, that's a very valid point. If that's what they think she was hit with, and the two that have blood on it don't have his prints on it, how can they say that he used it? I think he probably wiped the blood off of it, and then when he was setting it back down, his fingerprints got on it, and it didn't, dawn on him that he needed to wipe it down again. In response to Public Defender Walsh's statement about not having the actual ball in evidence, Assistant State Attorney Richard Clossie Jr. said that the ball and the fingerprint weren't the main evidence in the case. That's just what led them to Todd and what kind of broke the case open again. Attorney Clossie said that DNA match is what proves that Todd killed Sondra. He said, quote, "There's no other explanation for his blood being everywhere the killer's blood and robber's blood would be. He's the one that did it," unquote. Assistant Public Defender Courtney Wilson questioned the DNA evidence and the validity of it as matching to Todd's. Public Defender Walsh said that there were multiple things, like a wicker chair, some carpet in the store, that were not retested, and that was confirmed by Celinda Sowards, who was a forensic scientist with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office Crime Lab. There were other samples that weren't tested to see if they matched Todd's. Detective Stevens testified in saying that that's true, there were about 20 different samples that weren't submitted for retesting, that he had only specifically asked for the blood from around the cash register and leading from Sondra's body out the front door to be retested. Public Defender Wilson was adamant about the fact that she claims Todd was being framed. She says, quote, "The state needs you to believe, with no actual proof, that a man who's never been arrested before, married for 26 years, one day for no reason decides to come into a store, brutally beat a perfect stranger for no motive other than to take $100 out of a cash register and not take anything else. And then, in the past 21 years, someone who's capable of doing this has never had an encounter with law enforcement? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't add up," unquote. She's got a point. That does make sense. I kind of thought that at first too when I was reading that he had no record because the FBI had said that people around him were in danger and he couldn't control his temper. So you would expect that he would have domestic charges or assault charges or bar fights or something on his record, but there was nothing. When it was just the fingerprints and him looking similar, that didn't to me say that he conclusively did it because wrong place, wrong time situation. But once his DNA was confirmed as being there, I was like, yeah, that definitely has to be him. How could it be anyone else? 5 days after the trial started, it was over, and the jury had their decision. They only took 90 minutes to come to their decision. Almost 21 years to the date, just 1 day short, in fact, on August 23rd of 2019, Todd Barkett was found guilty of first-degree murder and robbery with a deadly weapon. He was given an automatic sentence of life in prison with no chance of release per Florida state law. So that's it. Todd's in jail for the rest of his life. He's not getting out, and the Better family finally got closure on this case. You know the deal. Talk with me about it on all the socials at Dark Happy Pod. You can listen on Spotify or wherever you're listening to this now for all future episodes. Leave me a review, rate the podcast. You can go to the website where you can find all the information that I've already given you. And I'll be here next week with another episode. So be ready and mark it down on your calendar. Bye!